Throughout the dark chapters of American history, the institution of slavery was a relentless force that inflicted unimaginable cruelty on black people. From their first arrival on the shores of the United States, Africans were systematically stripped of their humanity, forced into labor, and subjected to unimaginable abuses. Slaveholders employed every method, not only to exploit black labor, but also to assert their dominance. The horrors faced by enslaved people were not simply about forced work, although that alone was devastating, but also about a deeper psychological and physical control that permeated every aspect of their lives. One of the most harrowing elements of slavery was the sheer brutality used to maintain order. Enslaved people endured physical abuse, such as beatings and whippings, which were designed not only to punish but to break the human spirit. The whip, often seen as a symbol of slavery's terror, tore not only into the skin, but into the very dignity of the individuals subjected to its lash. The scars it left were both physical and emotional, etching a permanent reminder of the violence into the lives of the enslaved. These scars would become part of the generational trauma that still resonates within the black community today. But beyond the whips and chains, there were even more insidious practices. Enslaved families were systematically torn apart as husbands, wives, and children were sold off to different plantations, often never to be reunited. The destruction of family units was a deliberate act of control. Slaveholders knew that by severing these bonds, they could prevent rebellion and weaken the resolve of those enslaved. Women were particularly vulnerable, not only because of the backbreaking labor they were forced to perform, but also due to the rampant sexual exploitation they endured. Many were subjected to abuse by slave owners, with their children often sold as property, further entrenching the cycle of dehumanization. The suffering of black people under slavery was profound, and yet so much of their story remains untold. The black experience in the United States is one marked by resilience, resistance, and survival. Despite the systemic attempts to erase their culture and humanity, enslaved people found ways to resist, whether through subtle acts of defiance, maintaining their traditions, or by escaping to freedom. These stories of strength and endurance often go overlooked in the mainstream narratives of history, which have sometimes been sanitized or forgotten altogether. And today, in a time when the horrors of slavery should serve as a stark reminder of the past, there are still efforts by some to downplay or erase this history. Textbooks have been altered, monuments have been erected to figures who perpetuated the institution of slavery, and uncomfortable truths have been pushed to the margins. However, the legacy of slavery cannot be erased. The psychological, cultural, and social impacts remain embedded in American society, manifesting in the ongoing struggles for racial justice and equality. The history of slavery is not just a footnote in the story of the United States. It is a foundational element that shaped the nation's economic, social, and political systems. The labor of enslaved black people built much of the wealth that the country enjoys today. The scars of slavery run deep, not only in the memories of those who were directly affected, but also in the institutions that continue to reflect its legacy, from systemic racism to economic disparities. As we look back on this painful history, it is essential to do so with the goal of understanding and healing. The wounds left by slavery will never fully heal unless we confront them openly and honestly. Acknowledging the suffering of enslaved people, as well as the contributions they made to the country, is a critical step toward justice. The black community's fight for civil rights and equality is a testament to their enduring strength and determination in the face of oppression. And while much progress has been made, there is still a long way to go. The stories of those who lived and died under the brutal system of slavery deserve to be told, not in a way that glorifies or diminishes their suffering, but in a way that honors their humanity and recognizes their struggles. These are stories that challenge us to confront the darkest parts of history and reflect on how far we've come, but also how far we still need to go. Only by understanding the full scope of this tragic past can we hope to build a more equitable and just future. The justification for the brutal treatment of enslaved people lay in a deeply flawed ideology, one that prioritized control, profit, and power over human dignity. Slaveholders believed that maintaining a strict system of domination was necessary for the smooth functioning of the plantation economy. This rationalization allowed for the inhumane treatment of enslaved individuals, turning human lives into mere instruments for profit. The abuse extended far beyond the physical. The emotional torment inflicted was often just as devastating, if not more so. Families were torn apart as a deliberate strategy to keep the enslaved population fragmented and powerless. The forcible separation of parents from their children, of brothers from sisters, and of husbands from wives was a method designed to strip away any semblance of solidarity among those in bondage. The trauma of being ripped away from loved ones, with no hope of ever reuniting, added a cruel layer of despair to their already grim existence. The pain of these separations echoed through generations, a legacy of grief that would shape the collective memory of Black communities long after slavery ended. The constant threat of death hung over enslaved individuals, particularly for alleged crimes against white people. Accusations of offenses such as murder, assault, or arson could lead to swift and often extrajudicial executions. The threat of brutal punishments like mutilation, branding, and even burning was used to instill a sense of terror, effectively suppressing any hint of rebellion. This state of perpetual fear was a powerful tool wielded by slaveholders to maintain control and ensure compliance. The psychological toll was immense. Fear was a constant companion, haunting every waking moment and eroding the will to resist. Among the many forms of violence inflicted, sexual exploitation was a particularly heinous reality for enslaved women. Forced pregnancies were used to increase the enslaved population, adding another dimension of cruelty to the system. Women were doubly victimized, both as laborers and as targets of sexual violence. This exploitation was intended to strip away their autonomy and dignity, treating their bodies as commodities to be exploited. The children born from such exploitation were also treated as property, perpetuating the cycle of enslavement and dehumanization. The oppressive environment created by the threat of violence, both physical and sexual, reinforced the power dynamics inherent in the institution of slavery. Fear became the weapon used to maintain absolute authority. Any sign of dissent, any attempt to escape or resist, was met with swift and brutal retribution. The beating, a frequent and public spectacle, served as a reminder to all enslaved individuals of the consequences of defiance. The knotted whips, which tore into flesh and spirit alike, became symbols of the master's control and the enslaved people's suffering. The sale of enslaved individuals away from their homes and families was another cruel facet of this system. Being sold meant an uncertain future, new masters, new labor, and an unfamiliar and often hostile environment. It also meant leaving behind everything familiar, communities, culture, and the tenuous support systems they had managed to build under oppressive conditions. The sale of loved ones shattered these fragile communities, leaving people bereft of connection and hope. This deliberate fragmentation was intended to keep the enslaved people powerless, to break their spirit, and to strip them of any potential unity that could lead to collective resistance. Despite these horrors, the resilience of enslaved individuals shone through in countless small but significant ways. They found ways to hold on to their humanity, to resist the dehumanizing forces that sought to break them. Enslaved people preserved cultural traditions, shared knowledge, and supported one another as best they could. These acts of defiance, large and small, were powerful assertions of their identity and humanity in the face of relentless oppression. The legacy of slavery in the United States is not only one of suffering and brutality, but also one of resilience, strength, and the struggle for justice. The scars of slavery, emotional, cultural, and systemic, continue to shape the experience of Black people in America today. The historical reality of slavery is a painful chapter, but one that must be confronted with honesty if the deep wounds left by this institution are ever to heal. It is important to tell these stories not to dwell in despair, but to acknowledge the truth, honor the resilience of those who endured unimaginable suffering, and learn from the past. The history of slavery is a reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. It challenges us to create a future where such atrocities are not repeated and where every person, regardless of race or origin, is treated with dignity and respect. Families caught in the clutches of slavery faced unspeakable agony as they were torn apart by the domestic slave trade. The wrenching scenes of loved ones bidding farewell, with no assurance of ever seeing one another again, painted a heart-rending picture of the emotional devastation wrought by this merciless practice. Children were separated from their parents, siblings were divided, and couples were torn from each other, all in the name of profit and control. These were not just moments of grief, but also acts of calculated cruelty designed to weaken the bonds between enslaved individuals. The deliberate dismantling of families aimed to break any sense of unity that could potentially foster rebellion or resistance. In the brutal landscape of slave societies, violence was not only pervasive but also extreme, fueling debates, even among supporters of slavery, on whether such measures were necessary for maintaining control. The sad reality was that enslaved individuals were not recognized as unique human beings deserving of dignity. Instead, they were seen merely as property, valued solely for their ability to toil in the fields or serve in the household. This disregard for their humanity, their hopes, and their familial bonds underscored the deeply dehumanizing nature of slavery. It was not just physical suffering, but also a profound emotional anguish that tore at the hearts of those held in bondage. The commodification of human lives further deepened the scars left by the domestic slave trade, emphasizing the cold, calculating perspective that treated people as mere assets to be bought, sold, or traded. Families were torn apart for economic gain. Slaveholders saw nothing beyond the labor potential of those in their possession. The tears and pleas of children, mothers, and fathers were ignored in favor of the profit that could be made from selling them to the highest bidder. But why, one might ask, were slaves traded in such a heartless manner? The driving force behind the brutal practices of the domestic slave trade was, simply put, profitability. Enslaved individuals represented wealth to their owners, not just because of their labor, but because they could be sold and resold. This view reduced people to commodities, each with a price tag determined by age, health, and skill. The economic interests of slaveholders always took precedence over the humanity of those held in bondage. When the demand for labor increased in the expanding cotton and tobacco plantations of the Deep South, the trade of enslaved people within the United States became a lucrative business. It was driven by a relentless pursuit of profit, with no regard for the lives destroyed in the process. The systematic dismantling of families was not just a byproduct of this trade, it was an intentional tactic. Slaveholders knew that fractured families meant fractured communities, people who were less likely to band together and resist their oppression. By separating families, they could ensure a more controllable, isolated labor force. This stark prioritization of profit over the well-being and humanity of enslaved individuals highlights the moral bankruptcy at the core of the domestic slave trade. It was a system that thrived on breaking spirits, shattering bonds, and reducing human beings to the status of livestock. Yet, despite the immense suffering, the enslaved found ways to resist and maintain their humanity. Even when families were physically separated, they held on to the hope of reunion. Stories were passed down, names remembered, and connections forged across plantations in an effort to retain some sense of family and community. This resilience, in the face of overwhelming cruelty, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Now, let's discuss how enslaved individuals were treated in the southern and northeastern colonies. It's important to understand that the experiences of enslaved people varied depending on location and the types of labor demanded of them. In the southern colonies, the reliance on large-scale agricultural production, particularly of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice, meant that enslaved individuals often endured grueling, back-breaking labor from sunrise to sunset. The conditions were harsh, and the constant exposure to heat, inadequate nutrition, and brutal punishment made life nearly unbearable. Plantations operated on a rigid hierarchy, with overseers, enforcing discipline through violence to maintain productivity. In contrast, the northeastern colonies, where agriculture was less central to the economy, saw enslaved individuals employed in more varied roles. They worked in households, skilled trades, shipyards, and urban centers. While the type of labor was different, this did not mean that life was easier. Enslaved people in the North faced constant supervision, a lack of autonomy, and the ever-present threat of being sold. In both regions, the fundamental reality was that their lives were not their own. They were bound by the will of their owners, denied basic rights, and treated as less than human. It is crucial to acknowledge these differences, not to downplay the suffering of any group, but to provide a fuller understanding of the many forms that slavery took in early America. Despite regional variations, the core brutality and the denial of freedom remained consistent across the colonies. Enslaved people were deprived of their identities, their families, and their dreams. The scars of these injustices are not just historical. They continue to affect society today. If you are interested in learning more about these historical events and the stories of those who lived through them, please consider supporting us. Your subscription and likes help us create more educational content to share with the community. Our goal is to build a strong, informed audience that can reflect on history to understand the present better and work towards a future rooted in justice and empathy. The treatment of black slaves in the United States during the era of slavery exhibited stark regional disparities, with distinct and often disparate experiences unfolding in different parts of the country. These differences were shaped by the economic systems, labor demands, social hierarchies, and cultural attitudes prevalent in various regions. From the grueling brutality of the southern plantations to the differing economic roles and social frameworks in the northeastern colonies, these regional distinctions played a crucial role in shaping the lives and struggles of those held in bondage. In the southern colonies, slavery was a central institution, deeply integrated into every aspect of society. The vast plantation economies dominated the landscape, focusing on the production of cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar. These crops were labor-intensive and required a large, controlled workforce to maintain profitability. As a result, enslaved individuals in this region faced relentless physical and psychological brutality. The daily lives of enslaved people on southern plantations were defined by hard labor from dawn until dusk, with constant oversight from overseers or even the plantation owners themselves. The proximity of the slaveholders, who often lived on the plantations, meant that the enslaved were subject to immediate punishment for any perceived disobedience. Whipping, torture, and various other forms of violence became tools of control, used to instill fear and maintain productivity. The Southern experience of slavery was characterized by a harsh and unforgiving environment, where the economic reliance on large-scale agriculture fueled the complete dehumanization of those in bondage. Enslaved individuals were not seen as people, but as labor units, valued for their capacity to produce profits for their owners. The large, sprawling plantations created isolated worlds in which the enslaved were cut off from the outside community, making escape or resistance even more challenging. Social hierarchies were rigidly enforced, and the laws of the southern colonies were designed to uphold the institution of slavery and protect the interests of the slaveholding elite. In stark contrast, the northeastern colonies developed a different approach to slavery. While slavery was certainly present in the North, it did not dominate the economy in the same way as it did in the South. The absence of large-scale plantations led to a more varied economic structure, which in turn shaped the experiences of enslaved people differently. In the Northeast, many enslaved individuals worked in domestic service or in skilled trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, or shipbuilding. This more decentralized labor structure meant that enslaved individuals often lived in closer proximity to free people and sometimes even had more frequent contact with their owners, leading to a range of different experiences. However, it is essential to note that while the forms of labor may have differed, the underlying denial of freedom and humanity remained the same. The legal and social frameworks governing slavery also varied greatly between regions. In the South, where slavery was deeply entwined with the economy, the legal system was heavily biased in favor of the slaveholders. Laws were designed to keep enslaved individuals powerless, limit their mobility, and criminalize resistance. The social hierarchies of the South were rigid and unforgiving, with little room for upward mobility or improvement for those in bondage. These hierarchies reinforced the idea that black people were inherently inferior and helped to justify the harsh treatment they received. In the North, the absence of a plantation-driven economy allowed for a more diverse range of social and legal structures. Some northeastern states began to pass laws that gradually limited or even abolished slavery, leading to a somewhat less oppressive environment for the enslaved. However, even in these regions, enslaved individuals faced discrimination, restricted rights, and harsh treatment. The laws in the North might have been less explicitly brutal, but they still reinforced a system that treated black people as lesser beings, unworthy of the same freedoms and opportunities as their white counterparts. The types of labor that enslaved people were forced to engage in played a significant role in shaping their daily experiences and added to the complexity of their struggles. In the southern colonies, the labor was typically agricultural, involving physically demanding work in the fields, cultivating and harvesting crops. The work was exhausting and took place under the hot sun, with little rest and inadequate provisions. This labor was designed to extract the maximum amount of productivity, with no concern for the well-being or health of the laborers. In contrast, the northeastern colonies often employed enslaved individuals in urban settings or smaller farms, and the tasks varied widely. Some worked in households, performing duties such as cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. Others learned skills in trades like blacksmithing, shoemaking, or carpentry. While this work might seem less grueling compared to the field labor of the South, the enslaved still faced long hours, harsh oversight, and the constant threat of being sold or punished. Beyond the United States, a notable comparison can be found in the experiences of enslaved people in the West Indies. In these Caribbean colonies, the work was even more brutal and unforgiving than in the American South. The sugar plantations required relentless labor, and the enslaved people who worked there faced some of the harshest conditions in the Atlantic world. Unlike in the United States, many enslaved individuals in the West Indies were also responsible for producing their food and caring for the elderly and infirm during their limited free time. This added burden meant that, even when their workday was over, they had additional responsibilities that left them with little time for rest or recuperation. The regional disparities in the treatment of enslaved individuals highlight the complexity of slavery as an institution and the varied experiences of those who lived under its oppression. While the specifics of labor, oversight, and legal status might have differed, the core reality remained the same. Enslaved people were denied their humanity, subjected to the whims of their owners, and forced to live under a system that viewed them as property. The differences between the North and South, or between the United States and the Caribbean, underscore the adaptability of the institution of slavery. It evolved and changed to meet the economic and social needs of those in power, always at the expense of those who were enslaved. If we are to understand the full impact of slavery, it is essential to consider these regional differences and recognize that the institution of slavery was not monolithic. It was a system that shaped and was shaped by the societies in which it existed. The scars left by slavery are deep, not only in the United States, but across the entire Atlantic world. By acknowledging these complex histories, we can better understand the ongoing struggles for justice and equality faced by Black communities today. We hope that this exploration helps shed light on the diverse and often harrowing experiences of enslaved people throughout history. If you found this informative, please consider supporting our channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps us continue to produce content that educates and informs, allowing us to build a community dedicated to understanding our shared history. Here's an expanded version that aims for historical accuracy, adheres to YouTube community guidelines, and enhances the narrative flow. The additional burdens placed on enslaved individuals only added to the layers of complexity and hardship they faced, underscoring the oppressive nature of their condition. But why was all this brutality inflicted upon Black people? What was their mistake? The brutal treatment of black individuals during the era of slavery in the United States was not due to any wrongdoing on their part, but rather the product of historical, economic, social, and racial factors that drove the institution of slavery. Slavery in America was deeply intertwined with the economic interests of the Southern states. Large plantation economies relied heavily on the labor-intensive cultivation of cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and most significantly cotton. The profitability of these crops was directly linked to the exploitation of enslaved individuals, resulting in a system where economic gains were prioritized over humanitarian considerations. For plantation owners, maximizing profit meant forcing enslaved people to work long hours under the most grueling conditions, with no regard for their health or well-being. The entire Southern economy was structured around this exploitation, and as a result, any challenge to the institution of slavery was seen as a threat to both personal wealth and regional prosperity. The institution of slavery was also built upon racial prejudice and the dehumanization of black individuals. The prevailing belief among many white slaveholders and much of society was that people of African descent were inherently inferior and naturally suited for servitude. This belief was not based on any factual or moral basis, but was a constructed ideology used to justify the horrors of slavery. It provided a moral cover that allowed slaveholders to ignore the cruelty of their actions. By denying the humanity of those they enslaved, they could rationalize their treatment as necessary or even beneficial. Such dehumanizing ideology stripped enslaved people of their identities, reducing them to mere tools for economic benefit. Brutal punishments and oppressive tactics were frequently employed to maintain control and suppress any potential resistance or rebellion. Fear was a powerful weapon in reinforcing the power dynamics of the slave-master relationship. Enslaved people faced constant threats of violence, from whippings and beatings to even more severe punishments like mutilation or execution. The intention behind such brutality was not only to punish, but also to send a message to others, to deter dissent, and to maintain a climate of fear. Any hint of resistance, real or perceived, was met with extreme retribution to ensure that the enslaved population remained submissive and compliant. Slavery also established a deeply entrenched social hierarchy, with white slaveholders at the top and black slaves at the very bottom. The economic interests of the ruling class were closely tied to the subjugation of the enslaved population, and the system depended on a rigid social structure to function. This hierarchy was reinforced not just by violence, but by the legal system, religious justifications, and social norms that all worked together to maintain the status quo. Black individuals were stripped of their rights, denied access to education, and kept in a state of enforced dependency to prevent them from challenging their oppressors. The effects of this hierarchical system extended far beyond the era of slavery itself. Slavery laid the foundation for systemic racism that persisted long after its formal abolition. The degrading treatment of black people became ingrained in societal attitudes, contributing to a legacy of racial discrimination and inequality that persisted through Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, and beyond. Even after emancipation, the scars left by slavery continued to shape American society, with laws and practices designed to maintain the racial hierarchy that slavery had established. The brutality and dehumanization that black people endured during slavery left lasting wounds, both physical and psychological, that have been passed down through generations. The question remains, can these historical scars ever be healed? Can the pain inflicted by centuries of slavery and systemic oppression ever be fully addressed? The legacy of slavery is a complex and painful one, and its effects continue to be felt today in the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice. While progress has been made, the deep-rooted issues of systemic racism and social inequality still persist, making the path to healing a challenging one. The brutality of slavery was not born of jealousy or a mere wish to suppress. It was an intentional and calculated system designed to benefit a specific group at the expense of others. It was driven by economic gain, social control, and an ideology of racial superiority that sought to dehumanize and exploit. The question of forgiveness is a deeply personal one for many in the Black community. Forgiveness is not about excusing the past, but about finding a way to move forward, despite the historical injustices that have been endured. For some, it is a part of the healing process. For others, it is not possible without true recognition, accountability, and meaningful change. We would love to hear your thoughts on these important questions. Do you think the scars of slavery can ever be fully erased? Can society move beyond the injustices of the past? Or will the legacy of slavery always cast a shadow over the present? Let us know in the comments below. If you would like us to make more videos exploring the history of Black people, the resilience of those who fought against oppression, and the continued impact of this history on today's society, please support us by subscribing. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We are committed to building a strong, informed community that can learn from the past to create a better future.